Hi everybody. Thanks for joining me today. My name is Denise Ostmeyer. I'm the Animal Program Coordinator for Colorado State University, and I'm very happy to be here doing this presentation today. I know you can't tell from my webcam view, but I'm actually 8 months pregnant right now, which means that it would be very difficult for me to travel to a meeting to give any kind of presentation. So this is really a very cool opportunity for me. I'm very happy to be here, and I want to thank the program committee for inviting me to be a part of this. So we have a Q&A box that you guys can use if you have questions throughout. I was told to kind of keep it closed on my end so that it's not distracting until the end. So whatever questions that you have will get saved up until I finish with my presentation, and then hopefully we'll have some time left over at the end for that. So today I am going to be pointing out some different ways that we can all satisfy the training requirements that we have. And my primary responsibility at Colorado State University is as a trainer, and we have a pretty diverse program here. So then I'm going to be pointing out ways that we satisfy training requirements to accommodate all of our various situations throughout the presentation. Also, just want to apologize in advance. I do seem to be getting a little bit of a cold, and I will do the best I can, but unfortunately I think my voice may deteriorate a little bit throughout the presentation. Hopefully that won't be too distracting. All right, so as with most everything in our industry, our training program kind of goes back to and starts with the IACUC and how they choose to execute their massive responsibility of ensuring that personnel all have adequate training before they work with animals. I'll talk a little bit about why record keeping is such an important part of that and how we're keeping records here. And I have sort of a big laundry list that goes through and details all the different training requirements that we have. And I'll be running through that, starting with those that I'm going to refer to as the more basic or simpler to satisfy requirements, and then kind of moving along in complexity or specificity. So this is some of the language that's found in our regulations. I'm sure you're all familiar with already. It comes straight from the guide and the Animal Welfare Act regulations. It tells the IACUC that they need to make sure that staff are adequately trained, but it doesn't really give very much guidance on how we might go about accomplishing such a large task. So as an industry, that's why it's really important for us to share and try and kind of standardize some ideas. That's the spirit of my presentation today. I'm a big fan of beg, borrowing, and stealing training ideas whenever possible so as to not reinvent the wheel. And so I want to just share with you some ideas, and hopefully some of them might be helpful in your program. So record keeping is tremendously important. As you know, when you have inspectors come in, if you can't demonstrate records of something having happened, then as far as they're concerned, it didn't happen. And so the first big question with our record keeping is going to be paper versus electronic. And if you are capable of demonstrating your training adequacy with paper records, then by all means, I think you should just stick with it. There's no reason to invest the resources necessary in an electronic system. Paper records really were not sufficient for us just because of our size and the complexity of our program. And so I've taken the journey over the last few years from paper to electronic and can talk a little bit about how we've accomplished that. So I did briefly use a commercially available program, and there's lots of those out there. They can be very, very fancy. They can also be very expensive, but if the resources are there to buy a program, that's great. If not, what we did was we actually built our own system, and I can't say enough good things about it. It really has helped our program tremendously. It has lots of good points. One is that it's multi-department, so there's many different groups of people that are using the same training database. It enables us to deliver materials online and also to administer functionality for in-person classes. And it also does a bunch of administrative tasks like sending reminders, generating class lists, recording participation, and even administering quizzes. And it's not very fancy, but this is what it looks like when a student logs in. This is sort of the main interface that they would see. You can see across the top dark gray bar, that's a list of the departments that are all included. And then down below it lists the training that's available. If someone clicks on one of the departments, such as the animal care and use, then it specifies only the classes that are specific to that department. So you can see here that we have 4 online classes available. And if you have the ability to scroll down, you'd be able to see that we have many, many in-person workshops also. So from here, the student can click on Take Now and take one of the online classes. They can register for an in-person class. They can also see their own training record. So they can see when did they take CPR, when is their biohazard training due for renewal, what mouse classes have they taken. It's kind of a one-stop shop for them, which is very handy. For administrators, they can log in and see anybody's training records, so that's really handy for our IACUC coordinators to be able to log on and see whether someone took the training that they claim that they have taken. And one other really nice thing that happened for us when we implemented this training database is it improved the visibility of our classes, and it actually kind of advertised our training program for us. So this was developed in the Environmental Health and Safety Department, and they primarily were focusing on hazardous waste generator classes and biosafety type classes at first. And those are required, and they're also required to be repeated annually. So when they shared their program with us and allowed us to add our classes into their database, what happened was every time somebody logged in to take their required training, then they could see, oh, look at, there's all these mouse classes available as well. And so that was really a really big benefit for our program in general. So you might be wondering, what did all of this cost us? Seeing as how the department who developed it is not my department, it actually didn't cost us anything, which is just very fortunate for our department. The department that did develop it had to have the resources to dedicate a person to building it. And not only that, but once he finished building it, he has to continue to maintain it. And there's quite a bit of work involved there. So it's probably was, you know, his full-time job for a period of time, and has decreased down to maybe 10% of his effort at this point. All right, so let's talk a little bit about who is conducting the training. Many, many different people are completely qualified and excellent trainers, and whatever works for your facility is fine. It definitely makes more sense to have dedicated training staff if you are a larger facility, and if you have a larger volume of people who need the same kind of training. And so then the next group of people there is going to be what works better usually in smaller, maybe less centralized type facilities, where it's going to be supervisors and PIs who, that's kind of part of their other duties as assigned, rather than having dedicated training staff. And I definitely don't want to suggest one approach is better than the other. At CSU, we're taking an all of the above kind of approach. We do have a centralized portion of our program, and just to give you an idea of the scope of it, we report around 100,000 rodents per year, and we have one part-time dedicated trainer, which is me. And that level of staffing does seem to work very well for us. And having talked with other trainers at meetings and other gatherings, it seems to be pretty comparable to what other facilities our size are also doing. During the time when I was creating the training program and putting all the pieces in place, it was more like 100% of my job. It took up a lot more time. But now that everything's in place and it's just a matter of delivering and kind of ongoing improvement to the program, it fits very well into that 50% time frame of my job. We also have a decentralized portion of our program, which consists mostly of agriculture and wildlife research. And in that instance, we have lots of small groups that each one operates independently. And so in their case, it's this second group of people that I have mentioned on the slide that are doing the training, which works very well for them, particularly because what they're doing is oftentimes so specialized that they need someone that's an immediate part of their staff to be conducting the training. And of course, we all have lots of external resources available to us that I hope you guys are all taking advantage of. We do use the ALAS Learning Library some, and it's just one of several online modalities that are out there. By training consultants, I'm referring not only to consultant groups that come in and deliver training, but also just the kind of informal, all the time I'm emailing somebody to say, hey, do you know how to do this? And if I have something really interesting that I need to learn, maybe I'm traveling somewhere to learn something or bringing someone in. And then, of course, the printed materials kind of goes back to my beg, borrow, and steal thing, which I can't tell you how grateful I am when I go out on the web and find a material that's already available that I don't have to recreate for myself. So that brings me to my big laundry list. And I basically just took this straight out of the guide and the Animal Welfare Act regulations and plopped it on this slide here. I'm going to go through and talk about each and every one of these and different ways of satisfying these requirements. We're going to start with the things that I'm going to call the training basics. So I'm not calling them basics because I'm trying to suggest that these are easy topics or that they're not interesting or not complicated. But I do believe that these are factual-based, easy, straightforward to cover materials. So that makes them good for putting into media that's meant for mass consumption. It's also good because everyone needs the exact same information. So we might have a researcher that's out banding birds in the Galapagos Islands, and we might have somebody else that's infecting mice in an ABSL3 laboratory. Both of them need to know the same animal care and use legislation, the same information about the ICOOC function, and so forth. So my suggestions here, classroom-based, computer-based, or written. Those are the three modalities that are going to work really well. So the main advantage with computer-based training is that once you've invested the time that it takes to create the training, then there's very minimal upkeep type effort after that. Excuse me. Also, your researchers have the opportunity to take that training when they want to take it. And I know that they appreciate that with their busy schedules. Classroom training is kind of the opposite. You do have the trainer who has to be in the classroom investing their time each and every time it's offered. The researchers have to follow your schedule instead of following their own schedule. However, the huge advantage to classroom training, of course, over computer training is going to be the face time, which can be very difficult to achieve in today's workplace. Sometimes we have relationships with people for years without ever actually meeting them. And so when you have a classroom training that people come to, it gives you some pretty nice relationship building opportunities, and also gives you a chance to get real-time feedback to the training that's going on. And then written training, also a possibility here. I would say probably the lesser of the three, just because of the fact that there's a certain portion of people that are never going to read the materials that you give them. So it's a lot harder to ensure that they actually got the information that you're trying to deliver. So here is what we do. We have an online module that's delivered through the training database, and in addition to the list from the required training requirements, we're also adding in several others that fit very well with this training. And it is a required training. There is a quiz at the end, so the researchers have to go online and take the quiz before they're allowed to add themselves to a protocol. It has a nice little checklist over here on the side. So if you're like me and you like to make a list and check things off when you finish them, then this is a fabulous training modality, because we just checked off 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of our big requirements with pretty minimal effort. So this particular training took me about a week to write, and then it passed through a whole bunch of different offices, and several different people had to tweak it and stamp it with approval. So maybe a month total in development. So not a huge investment of time up front. But we've had so many people take this training that we don't even know who all of them are. So when you go online and look at the list of people who've taken it, some of them are like out in housing and dining services and really kind of odd departments that you wouldn't expect. So in addition to satisfying a training requirement, it also has kind of served a little bit of an outreach function at our university, which is nice. And now I'm going to start moving on to slightly more specific topics. So occupational health and safety is the next one on my list. And for some of you, this may fit very well into the basic training that we just talked about. If you have most of your people working with similar animals, similar types of hazards, for us it's actually quite specific, because we have people who are working out in the environment, we have people who are working with all different kinds of animals and different kinds of research. And so for our wildlife folks, it's completely appropriate for them to be trained on how to handle a mountain lion attack, but they really don't need to be trained on how to avoid a repetitive motion injury from changing mouse cages. And so if you want your staff to care about the training and to be engaged with what you're telling them, then it's always best to try and specify things to what really matters for someone in their actual job. And so when thinking about your occupational health and safety training, you want to worry about who are you training. I have just selected 4 different groups of types of animal users, for example. There are other groups that we deal with that aren't included here, like administrative people who, just because of the proximity of where they work or being exposed to allergens, possibly, our facilities maintenance folks and visitors and other groups. The what is going to be what specific hazards and mitigations do they need to learn about. And so for our small animal users, for example, allergies is a huge one. Ergonomics, like I mentioned, the repetitive motion injury is very important. Our staff that are working in ABSL 3 are going to need to know how to minimize production of aerosols. They need to know how to go to a hospital and get the correct kind of medical attention if they're exposed to an exotic agent. Large animal users, there's crushing injuries that could potentially occur. They might be working outside, so just being out in the elements might be one of their occupational hazards. And then our field biologists, of course, have to worry about endemic zoonotic diseases such as hantavirus. And then the how looks very similar to my basic training list. This is also a nice topic to put into like a mass media kind of modality if you have the ability to do that. And a couple of other suggestions I have here. One is your protocol forms, which we don't always think about as being educational. But if your PI has to specify in a protocol form, what is the hazard, how are you mitigating the hazard, and how are you training your staff on how to be safe doing their work, then that's a pretty good way of showing that they're trained in occupational health and safety. And also, depending on how you use your risk assessment form and how your medical providers follow up with people after they've completed the risk assessment, that is another possibility for providing training without expending a lot of additional effort. So Our largest group that has the same occupational health and safety hazards is our animal care staff. This is what I do for them. I have not put it online because there's not a tremendous amount of turnover, so I'm only training a few people every several months or something like that. So it's just a PowerPoint presentation that we do in a classroom. It does address all of the hazards that they encounter, but I focus specifically on the ones that actually cause injuries or actually cause problems for the staff. So allergies, again, is a really big one, and the repetitive motion injuries are huge for us. And so I have several slides that just talk about stretching and how often should you take a break to do the stretching and what kinds of things you can do to protect yourself from those types of injuries. All right, so now we're going to move on to even more specific training, which is going to become technical in nature. So lumping all together the next 3 requirements into what I'm going to call animal handling. So that covers basic animal needs, proper handling, and euthanasia. And then also I definitely include whatever common procedures that your research folks are going to be doing into this type of training. Since we're now talking about hands-on technical procedures, you have to have hands-on technical training. There's no way of helping a person become competent at a technical procedure without them actually physically doing the procedure. But having said that, I do think there's still a place for handouts and for online type training for animal handling. So I have handouts for every hands-on class that I do. I think they're very important for adding a layer of repetition, especially after the class is over, if someone wants to go back and review how something is done. And these are a couple of examples. One is from my guinea pig handout and one is from my mouse handout. And they just are meant to demonstrate how I break everything down step by step and use a lot of big, high quality color photos, which I think is extremely important. I know that for me personally, if I'm trying to learn or perfect or tweak a procedure that I do, I go out on the web and I try and find pictures of other people doing it. And I'm ever so grateful when I can find something like that. Oftentimes that's all I need to help me figure out precisely how to do something new. Excuse me. And the grainy, small black and white photos really don't do a whole lot for me. So definitely go looking on the web. You can find a lot of stuff that's readily available. I would like to offer up any training materials that I have. So if there's anything that I talk about during the presentation that you think you might want to have a copy of, just email me later. I'd be more than happy to send it to you. And also, I just wanted to give a shout out to LAWTE at this point, which is the Laboratory Animal Welfare Training Exchange. If you are not a member and you are involved with training, you should very seriously consider joining. It's really inexpensive. They have a place for members only on their website where you can go and get other people's training materials that they're freely sharing that you can take and use however you need. They also have a meeting every other year, which I've attended 3 times now and really have found to be the most beneficial meeting for me. I get the most takeaway from that meeting than any other that I attend. So then back to my slide. I also use an online module. It's only for my mouse class, and the reason is that I have more volume of people coming through my mouse class than all of my other training put together. And so I do everything I can to make that class very, very efficient and make it run very smooth, just to try and help with that large volume of people. So the training database will stop you when you try to sign up for the mouse class and say you have to take the online module first. And so then once someone takes that, then it allows them to sign up for the mouse class. So by the time someone comes to my class, I know that they've already had this preview of what we're going to be doing. And I think it helps in a few different ways. For one, it adds a layer of repetition, kind of like I mentioned with the handouts, but in this case it's in advance. So by the time someone has come to my class and I've given a demonstration and they're at their table getting ready to pick up a mouse, they've already had the really important concepts hit on at least twice. And I think that helps people to kind of get moving and reinforces ideas. Another way that I think it's helpful is for people who have a language barrier. So our English as a second language folks who may have much better reading comprehension than listening comprehension have had an opportunity to review the material in written form and in pictures in the online module before they come to class. And then finally, I like it because it means that there's not going to be any surprises for people when they show up to the class. This may not relate to all of you, but I have a lot of undergrad students and a lot of people who have never had any exposure to animal research before coming through. And there have been a few instances where someone came to class and became upset by what we were doing in class. So with using the prerequisite online module, people already know what's going to happen, and they know kind of what it looks like. They know that we're going to be euthanizing mice at the end of the class, so we don't have any of those disruptive surprises happening. All right, so we already talked about how your animal handling training is going to be hands-on, so then the next big question is, can you handle just online, or excuse me, just on demand, as needed, one-on-one kind of training, or is your program big enough that you need to implement regularly occurring wet labs or workshops? It'd be really nice if you could obtain data about how many people get added to a mouse protocol every month that are brand new, or that type of information to help determine whether there's a big enough demand there and how often you might need to have classes. Probably many of you don't have that kind of information available. I know that I didn't. And so we felt that there was certainly a need for a regularly occurring class. So the way that we determined how frequently to offer it and so forth was pretty much just by trial and error. We put the class together and we offered it and just decided to see what happens. So what happened was it filled with a huge wait list, and so we repeated it and it filled with a huge wait list, and we had numerous iterations of this, which really kind of pointed out a benefit of having a regular class over just the on-demand training, which is that there was this huge backlog of people who wanted to be trained but were not coming forward and asking for the training for whatever reason. And so by just putting it out there that we're having a class, come and see what we have to offer, it brought all of those people out. So there was this huge surge of people, and then it was kind of strange because after that there was very little demand at all, and we offered the class quarterly and it never filled, and we knew that there was a need out there, but people were not aware that the training was being offered was really the problem. So we had to put a lot of effort into advertising, and as I mentioned, the training database helped us with that by increasing the visibility of our program. But we did flyers and newsletters and emails, and eventually, maybe by word of mouth more than anything, the word got out and the demand started to go up. And so it's still going up, and so we just kept offering the classes more frequently, and we've gotten to the point where we're offering the mouse class once a month, and it usually almost fills. I don't usually have a wait list, so that was our clumsy way of determining how often we needed to offer the class. About once a month seems to work very well. I imagine there will come a time when I'll start having a wait list on my once a month classes, and at that time then we'll just start offering it twice a month. So our next question up here is required or voluntary, and by this I'm talking about the IACUC, of course. So some places will say if you're going to work with mice, you're going to take mouse class A, B, and C. And so that's the required approach. I think one really big benefit to doing it that way is that you catch everybody and that you know that everybody's had the same training on all of the procedures and you don't have to worry about people falling through the cracks. Probably the biggest disadvantage to that method is that not all the researchers want or need to take all of that training, and that's potentially increasing their perception of administrative burden or undue burden that they don't want to have to deal with. So on the other hand, you have IACUCs who do not have the required training. This is how our IACUC functions. And I think it actually puts more of the burden back on the committee and less of the burden on the researchers, because they have to evaluate each person as an individual and determine based on their training record, yes, they're qualified, or no, they're not qualified. And if they are not qualified, here's how they're recommending that they go about getting that needed training. One thing that our IACUC does a lot is they'll take a training record and look through it and say, okay, we believe you that you have adequate training, and also we're going to require that someone come out and watch you do your procedure the first time to verify that in fact you do have the required training. So I do think that approach is just maybe a little bit friendlier to the research staff and maybe a little more work on the part of the IACUC. And that brings me to my last bullet point on here, which is, what do you do when Dr. Smith calls you up and says, I just bought a whole bunch of alligators and I need to get blood from them next week. Can you come over and show me how to do that? So this is what makes being a lab animal trainer both pretty fun and also pretty challenging at the same time. Obviously, the easy answer to that question would be no, I can't come help you. I have no idea where you might get alligator blood from, nor have I ever touched one before. But of course, that answer does not really meet the spirit of our regulations, which say that as a facility, we're going to provide training to researchers to ensure that they're able to humanely work with their animals. And it's important to remember that as a person who works for a laboratory animal department, that you have probably many more resources and connections than any individual PI is going to have. And you need to use those connections to help them as best you can with their weird training requests, no matter how strange they are. So that might mean that the trainer gets to go out and learn something new and bring it home, or it might mean that the trainer has to find a place that the PI can travel to learn a procedure or bring a consultant in. But at any rate, you need to make your best effort to satisfy even the weirdest of training requests. All right, so continuing on with our technical topics is anesthesia and analgesia. And if you have enough staff who need the same kind of training in anesthesia and analgesia, then offering the class is a great idea. The way we do it is we have half lecture, half hands-on class. It is only geared towards rodents because that's where our biggest volume is, and if someone is working with another species, then we handle that as a one-on-one, as-needed kind of request. And these are the topics that we cover in the lecture half, which comes first. Then we move on to the hands-on portion and have developed a good workflow for how to make this part move quite smoothly. We start out by weighing animals, mixing up drugs, calculating, and then injecting anesthetics. Then we watch the mice very closely while they fall asleep so that we can observe them moving through the different stages of anesthesia. Also, we can observe when they lose specific reflexes and monitor parameters to determine depth of anesthesia. Once they have all become anesthetized, then I bring out several isoflurane machines. I try and pick some that look a little different from each other, so not just all of the same. And they're completely disassembled when I bring them out, so people taking the class can actually put their hands on the machines, hook up the hoses, fill them up, turn on the oxygen, and learn about how the gas flows through the machine, because isoflurane training is really as much about understanding that machine and how to make the machine work even when you have some kind of a problem than anything else. So once the machines are assembled, then they anesthetize mice with isoflurane, which gives them a chance to go through the induction part again, and then also to watch the recovery phase. And by the time that's finished, some of the animals that we injected were given very light doses, and they're already starting to wake up. And so then that's another opportunity to monitor anesthesia recovery. And I'm going to lump the next three technical topics together as surgical training. So our next three items off the list are aseptic surgical technique, surgical training, and pre- and post-procedural care. And if you have sufficient need to put together a class for this, I have a couple of suggestions about how that might look, because we actually have two different ways that we offer this. The first is actually it's a for credit university class. It's offered through our animal sciences department, and it is comprehensive not only of the three topics in the title of the slide, but also anesthesia and analgesia. It's a week long. It does include live animal surgery, which in this case is ovariohysterectomy, and it's offered every other time with a different species. So large animal users and small animal users can choose the more appropriate species for themselves and take it either with rats or with sheep. The second method that we're going to be doing, I'm going to call the everything but surgery workshop. So this will actually not include any live animals at all. It will just be done with models and include aseptic technique, instruments, suturing, and general surgical principles. And then as a follow-up to that workshop, then the trainer will go into the lab with the researcher with their actual animals and their actual surgical procedure. So one really nice thing about conducting it in this way is that the trainer can actually verify that the researcher took the information from the workshop and applied it correctly back to their own workspace. And also a reduction in the number of animals that are being used, because we aren't going to use animals in just in demonstration. All right, and that brings me to the last item on our list of requirements, which is regular continuing education for animal care staff. And this is something that can certainly be done in any way imaginable. It can just be a supervisor walking around and talking with their staff. It can be field trips, it can be seminars, it can be hands-on workshops. We do have a regular CE event for our staff every other week here, and that seems to work well. And I know a lot of other facilities are using that same idea. I have just a list here of topics that are good ones for CEs for animal care staff. I'm sure you guys probably could add 20 or so more to this list. But here are some ideas. And then finally, I just wanted to give you my contact information, and again make the offer that I'm definitely happy to share with you any materials that I have, anything that I talked about in the presentation today. And thank you very much for joining me. And now I will open up my Q&A box and see if there's any questions that I can answer for you. right now. Okay, so how often do you require refresher training? So as I mentioned, our IACUC does not require any of the hands-on training specifically, so that'd be never for that. It's on an individual one-on-one basis. The basic module, that's the online one showing all the basic items. That one's every 3 years, and the reason that 3 years was selected is because our protocols can potentially last for 3 years. So that really is where that time frame came from. Next question, how much, if any, of your coursework is available to anyone online outside of your institution? So, none of it. The online, the training database only allows you access if you have a CSU ID. So I would be happy to share with you the PowerPoints. I would have to just redact like the CSU specific information, but they're not available to the general public. All right, next question. With euthanasia training, are you utilizing a model for cervical dislocation or euthanizing an animal per person per class? So for us, our mice that we use for training are all donated. They're mostly culls from transgenic breeding colonies that don't have the right genetics. And so they're going to be euthanized anyway, and we honestly have more than we can use. And so I do euthanize an animal, at least one animal per person per class, rather than using a model, just for the fact that those animals are already readily available and they're going to be euthanized anyway. So there isn't really a need for us to look for an alternative there. Next question. How do you respond to PIs that suggest that the surgical and anesthetic training is too intensive, time consuming, or do you have this complaint? So as I mentioned, our hands-on training is not required necessarily by the IACUC, and I have found that with this more voluntary training that people are always there because they want to be and not because they're made to be, and so I guess I'm kind of lucky in that I don't have that complaint where people are complaining that they are being forced to take training that they don't want. So I don't think I have like a really good answer to that one. All right, what regime of anesthesia do you use in your classes for mice and rats? So the way that I determined what anesthetics to focus on in the class was I pulled all of our protocols and I ran a report on all of the anesthetics that are in there. And I found out that with very, very few exceptions, it was a really small list. So I just focus on those particular drugs, which are ketamine, xylazine, acepromazine, pentobarbital, dexmedetomidine, and isoflurane. So we talk real briefly about the fact that there's all these other drugs out there and chat with our veterinarians if you need to find an alternative, but in the class we focus just on the primary ones that we are actually being used at our facilities. Do you train undergraduate students with your surgical training program, or is this saved for grad and postdocs? It's available to anybody who's going to be involved with research, surgery, and so that definitely does include undergraduate students, although to a lesser extent. Next one says, wonderful presentation, thank you. Do you deal with PIs who are MDs, and if you do they follow the same? And then I don't see the rest of the question. Okay, so here at CSU, I don't deal with MDs very much because we don't have a medical school. We have a veterinary school. In a previous job, I did work with a lot of MDs, so I can see why maybe where this question is coming from. They don't always have as good of attitudes about being trained on veterinary procedures. But yeah, no, we don't have very many MDs that we're working with here. How many student to trainer ratio do you have for your classes? Does it depend on the kind of class? So for the hands-on classes, I prefer to have one instructor for every 3 students, if at all possible, because if you have more students per instructor than that, the class just like grinds to a halt, because there's going to be people who just stand there until you're next to them holding their hand. So I try very hard to have that 3-to-1 ratio. All right, I think that is all of our questions, unless some new ones come in. No. Okay, so it looks like that concludes my presentation today. Thank you everyone very much for attending.